On August 24, 1814, British troops entered Washington after the American defeat at Bladensburg. The capital was not a fortress. It was a young republic's unfinished seat of government, filled with public buildings, official records, portraits, books, and symbols of national permanence that were still fragile enough to burn. The war had already tested the borders, the lakes, and the Atlantic coast, but now the question moved to the center of American authority. Could a government survive when an enemy column reached the place that represented it? The immediate military story began outside the city. British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn moved inland from the Chesapeake. American militia regulars and officials tried to stop them near Bladensburg, but confusion, heat, weak coordination, and a collapsing defensive line opened the road to Washington. President James Madison and members of his cabinet watched events unravel from near the field. They were not witnessing a distant raid. They were watching the defense of the capital fail in real time. The defeat mattered because Washington was physically exposed. The city was still young, scattered, and partly unfinished. It did not have the defensive depth of an older capital. Roads, bridges, civic offices, and public squares stood close to rural ground. British troops could move from battlefield to government buildings in the same day. That speed made the humiliation sharper. The Republic had declared war on the world's strongest naval power, and now its own capital had become reachable. Inside the city, Dolly Madison understood that the crisis was not only military. As servants and aides prepared to leave the president's house, she insisted that Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington be saved. The famous act was practical, symbolic, and urgent. It connected an emergency evacuation to a larger question, whether the Republic's memory could survive when its rooms and walls could not. The painting mattered because Washington's image was more than decoration. It was a visible claim that the constitutional experiment had a past worth preserving. Other people carried away records, papers, and portable evidence of government work. Clerks, servants, families, and officials moved through smoky streets with bundles, trunks, and carts. The evacuation was uneven, frightened, and improvised, but it showed that institutions lived partly in people and memory, not only in stone. Washington's buildings could be entered. The government's continuity depended on what could be removed, remembered, and restarted after the raid. British troops reached the capital that evening. They burned the Capitol, including congressional spaces and the Library of Congress. They set fire to the president's house. They damaged the Treasury and other public offices. The destruction was selective, aimed at government power and retaliation rather than a general massacre of civilians, but the symbolism was devastating. Flames rose from the center of a government that had declared war 2 years earlier and now looked shockingly vulnerable. The Capitol fire carried special meaning. Congress was the place where the war had been debated, authorized, criticized, and funded. Burning its chambers was an attack on national decision-making. The loss of books and public materials also mattered. A republic that argued through law, memory, and precedent lost part of its working mind in the flames. The damage was not just architectural. It was an assault on the habits of government. The president's house fire created a different image. The executive home in flames while the president and his family were gone. It was not yet known as the White House in the modern sense, but it already represented the elected presidency. Seeing it burn suggested that high office did not make the republic invulnerable. The building could be damaged like any other structure. What mattered was whether the office, the law, and the public's confidence could outlast the smoke. Cockburn and Ross did not try to occupy Washington permanently. Their purpose was punishment, humiliation, and strategic pressure. The British wanted to answer American attacks in Canada and demonstrate that coastal mobility could strike deep. That limited objective did not make the raid small, it made it sharper. The goal was to wound American pride, shake confidence, and force leaders to reckon with the costs of a war that had reached home. Civilians experienced the night as fear, movement, and uncertainty. Some watched fires from the edges of streets. Others fled with children, horses, goods, and whatever could be carried. The city was not erased, but it was transformed into a landscape of smoke, rumor, and exposed authority. The absence of a general massacre did not remove the shock. Washington had been entered, and its central symbols had burned. Weather helped end the occupation. A violent storm struck the city, scattering debris, dimming fires, and making the British position less secure. Later accounts remembered fierce wind and a tornado-like force cutting through the capital. Whether treated as weather, omen, or battlefield accident, the storm gave the story a dramatic turn. Human power had burned public buildings. Nature helped interrupt the occupation and push the raiders away. Ross and Cockburn withdrew after roughly a day. Washington was left charred, humiliated, and politically shaken, but not abandoned. Officials returned to ruins. Citizens assessed blackened walls, broken rooms, wet ashes, and the practical problem of governing after a visible disaster. The question became whether rebuilding would be treated as routine repair or as a statement that the national government still had legitimacy. The answer was rebuilding. The Capitol would be restored, the executive mansion would be repaired and later become known as the White House. Congress continued, the presidency continued. The war moved on toward Baltimore, where defense, morale, and bombardment would produce a different national memory. The burning of Washington did not end the United States. It forced Americans to separate the idea of government from the buildings that housed it. That is why August 24th remains more than an embarrassing wartime episode. It was a test of institutional survival. A capital can be entered, symbols can burn, public confidence can be shaken in a single night. But a government endures when people preserve records, restore authority, rebuild public spaces, and refuse to let humiliation become collapse. The burning of Washington showed how fragile the Republic looked in 1814, and how much of its survival depended on choices made after the flames.